One of the great mysteries, perhaps unacknowledged, of The Shining is the presence of the impossible room. The general manager, Stuart Ullman's office, has a window in it which should not open to the outside world. It shouldn't have anything shining through it, because it's surrounded by other rooms. Nevertheless, it's the communication center of the building, and partly this may be what it symbolizes, because when the job interview is conducted, there's light shining in. When Wendy goes to talk to the forest rangers over the radio, there's light shining in. But when Jack sabotages the radio, the room is dark. There are three interconnected mysteries, as I see it, that I don't see mentioned by other people. These are the impossible room, the Adler typewriter, and Wendy, specifically what Wendy can do. Stephen King criticized Wendy as Stanley Kubrick portrayed her, as someone who just did nothing but run around and scream. But her first appearance in the movie, I think, shows otherwise. She's an enormous multitasker. She drinks coffee, smokes, reads The Catcher in the Rye, a more difficult book than anything we see Jack read, listens to TV, and talks to Danny all at the same time. And I don't think that's all she does, believe it or not. She is a very busy woman at that point, and throughout the movie, really. She takes care of the boiler when Jack doesn't. She takes care of Jack when Jack doesn't. And this strikes me, to some degree, as a characteristic way that authors portray themselves. Because when they're the heroes of their own books, they're shown doing everything, and doing everything right, at times. So the possibility exists that, in addition to what people talk about as possible scenes where Jack might be showing himself as a character in his own novel, we might also have Jack and others being shown as characters in at least Wendy's imagination, if not Wendy's novel. The initial job interview with Ullman and Jack, and with Bill Watson, has very strange things that happen during its progression. Jack obeys what I would see as the usual job interview etiquette, which is you don't partake of an intoxicating or addictive substance in your job interview unless the job interviewer is doing the same and offers you some. So Ullman asks if he would like some coffee, and Jack says yes, if you're having some. Right after that scene, we cut away to a scene, first time we see Wendy, and among all these other things she's doing, she's drinking the coffee. So it's as if she is being interviewed as well as Jack at the same time. There are various other objects that blink in and out of existence or change position, and they all have something to do with Wendy or with writing or with the subject of the writing in the movie. These are books, including the Red Book by Carl Jung, which appears on the desk and then shifts its position. A white pen under Ullman's left hand, which points in slightly different directions at different times, and a cigarette in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen when looking at Ullman, which appears and disappears. Now, we never actually see Jack smoke. Interestingly, we see Wendy smoke about 5 times, possibly 6, and each time she smokes, Jack does not witness her smoke. Wendy also smokes, it seems, almost as if she's sending up smoke signals as a background message for something she can't quite communicate to other people, particularly when she's talking to the doctor about Jack and Danny's past history, potentially abusive past history. It's as if she's sending up this smoke signal to say in the background that something might be wrong, which she can't quite acknowledge either to the doctor or to herself, or both. During the job interview, the characteristic objects associated, I believe, with Wendy are what appear and disappear. So we are shown in the interview as if it's being seen partly through Wendy's eyes. The final cutaway at the end of the job interview, and I'll explain this one because it's easiest to understand, has Jack's face overlain on the stomach, his eye on the stomach of Danny. And right after Danny appears, he is talking to Tony in the mirror, and Tony is telling him that Jack got the job. So he has information that he could have attained only through shining. Before this, at the very beginning of the job interview, Jack passes a picture on the way into Ullman's office. It's been identified as Great Mother, and it's painted by a Paleo-American artist. The people who were there, or have ancestors who were there before America was called America by the Europeans. Jack goes into the office. It's a relatively short scene, and when Susie, the secretary, takes the brown ledger off Ullman's desk and goes to get coffee, you get this crossfade where one scene ends and one scene overlaps with the next one. At that point, we see the light shining in behind Ullman, and we see a view of a sunny parking lot, which is the outside looking into the window of the Torrance's apartment in Boulder. So it's as if the distances between the window of the apartment in Boulder, where Wendy and Danny are, and the window of the Overlook Hotel, which is shown overlooking in a way because two looks are superimposed over each other. It's as if that distance has disappeared, and you can look from one window right into the other. In the next scene, we have an over-the-shoulder from Boulder view. We start the interview looking over Stuart Ullman's right shoulder, looking at Jack. Then focus shifts around and we're seeing things more through Jack's eyes. At the end of that, there's a crossfade. And when Jack's face is fading out, Wendy's face is fading in, larger and hanging above him, almost like an omniscient deity, as if she's seeing everything that's going on. And here, I think, is where we get the hint as to whether Wendy can shine, although no one virtually seems to discuss it at all. They discuss it with Danny first and Halloran, of course, because that's obvious. They talk about it. And with Jack as well, and that he might be repressed as a shining, and that's why Danny's images get into his head. But with Wendy, it seems to me, she might have the equivalent of what today is commonly called remote viewing. Halloran and Danny can do this in a sense because they can see the past and the future, but Wendy seems to be capable of seeing across distance, which would make going to the hotel intriguing for her in a way because she could always see the outside world. She sees the cigarette blink in and out of existence because she's watching the interview in her mind's eye while her own cigarette is sitting on the table in front of her, smoldering. So parts of the image she sees in the physical world around her are overlain with the interview scene, in which she is, in a way, taking part. That's how I see it. Now, what is discussed in the job interview is in large degree whether Jack is comfortable with the philosophy and approach to writing of Carl Jung. Interviews are often, one way or another, having to do with outlook, belief, values, philosophy, and seeing whether those of the interviewer and the interviewee match. Ullman is essentially saying, we're hiring you to work in a place where one of the previous guys chopped up his wife and son and killed himself. Are you okay with that? And Jack says, I'm intrigued, sign me up. So it's about whether someone is willing to do the sorts of things that Jung did in order to write the Red Book. I've watched a video on the subject of the Red Book, and it's very similar. It's very spooky and has much of the same things happening in it, including mentions of the title of the movie, which occur in the Shining movie. So it's largely about whether Jack is willing to approach things in the same way as Carl Jung, and you see him do that. He retreats from the world, spirals into a world of the unconscious and madness in order to try to get ideas for his writing. This is not the only way to do things, however, and he faces a writer's block perhaps because there is a countervailing influence at work, as I see it. Wendy's name officially is Winnifred, and Halloran brings this up, asks if she's a Winnie or a Freddie. And these both have meanings. Winnie is from Winona, which is Sioux, one of the pre-European tribes of North America. And she's shown wearing a jacket that looks like it's from one of those tribes at one point when she goes to contact, while smoking, the forest rangers. So she's sending up essentially her smoke signal. And she usually smokes when trying to communicate with someone. Now, the other meaning, there's a Welsh and Indian are the sources, or Welsh and early American, pre-European influence American sources are the ones for Winnie. But Freddie is short for Alfreda, which is the female German form of Alfred. So Winnifred is in part named for Alfred. The other part that she chooses to say to Halloran is Wendy, which is a name made up by the author of Peter Pan. So in a way she's identifying with an author. So they have many of these meanings. But the Alfred is important because it ties into the typewriter. If somebody saw, in the movie, a typewriter with the name Jung, like Carl Jung, or Freud for Sigmund Freud, they'd immediately think there was a symbolic tie-in and a reference to the works of those people. But surprisingly, I haven't found any reference with anybody saying about Adler. And there was a guy named Alfred Adler, who was a contemporary, close associate, in fact, of Freud. When Sigmund Freud published his book on the interpretation of dreams, he didn't initially get all good reviews, and Adler defended him and became someone that Freud met with and formed societies with and corresponded with on a regular basis, and with whom Jung also would have been, therefore, familiar. Although at one point, one of them, I think Freud, said to Jung that Adler was being paranoid, which is the same thing that Jack tells Wendy after she says that Danny was strangled by the woman in room 37. So Alfred Adler, had a very different approach to psychotherapy, although he was initially in close contact with Freud. They went their own ways and developed their own approaches. And several of these persist to this day. Adler was greatly influenced by his wife, who is a communist or socialist and a feminist, and he looked at personality in respect that you can't separate it from environment. That people are products of their environment, their family upbringing, and their mental health can be measured in large degree by the extent to which they are enmeshed and involved in their communities. So an Adlerian would not approach writing, particularly psychologically based writing, from the standpoint of it being isolation and spiraling into a world of madness and on the unconscious, like Jung did in writing the Red Book. And you see this with Wendy. She tries to engage with Jack to get him to write, and he pushes her away. This is, in a way, a conflict between an Adlerian approach and a Jungian approach. So Wendy, therefore, represents the Jungian. And she's very different from Jack. Now, I think she might actually shine because people who see visions are the ones who supposedly see things that other people don't. And Wendy, in a way, would be the best example of this, except that Halloran doesn't realize it because she has a slightly different application of the shining ability than what he and Danny have. They know things and can communicate mind to mind, but they don't see things visually over a distance. They see things over time. And as the movie progresses, since there's a link apparently between shining and abuse, because people who have the ability tend to get attacked even by their own family, then it seems to me that Wendy might not have visions until near the very end of the movie, because she's trying to not think about the possibility that Danny has his visions because he's been abused by Jack. Once they're attacked at knife point or axe point by Jack and she tries to fend him off, then she no longer perhaps has any reason to ignore what she can see beyond her other previously known abilities, and that's perhaps why the hotel horrific visions, particularly ones related to what she said and thought, start to pop up at that point.